As 1945 dawned, the Allies had the pincers of their encirclement strategy well and truly closed around the last pockets of German resistance. Victory was close, but how exactly did it come about? How did Germany fall? And what role did propaganda play in bringing an end to the conflict? On May, in a grand ceremony in Reims, France, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. This marked the official end of the Second World War in Europe and the beginning of victory celebrations across the continent. But this was not the end that any of the belligerents had envisioned at the start of the war. In fact, each power would experience victory in vastly different ways than they'd imagined. The final days of the war in Europe were dominated by the news of Field Marshal Keitel's surrender. But actually, technically speaking, the war in Europe officially ended 8 days earlier with the surrender of German forces in Italy. On April 29, 1945, Italian Field Marshal Giovanni Battista Montesi signed the instrument of Italian surrender aboard the battleship HMS, effectively bringing an end to the German campaign in the south. But it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. As we've discussed before, Mussolini's decision to surrender to the Allies was actually motivated more by fear of what the advancing Americans might do to him than anything else. Sure, he was scared of being encircled by the British, too, but after 2 years of constant insults, complaint, and thinly veiled threats, Mussolini really didn't want to be taken prisoner by his former ally. After all, when you spend most of your time in office, appeasing, supporting, and enabling another country's plans for world domination, then the moment they turn on you, you know you're in trouble. With that in mind, Mussolini escaped north to join the Germans and spent his last few weeks in power in a desperate bid to save his own skin when the going got tough. In other words, Mussolini decided that it was time to go full fascist. At first, the Germans weren't keen on taking him in, suspecting that the Italians planned to surrender to the Allies and thinking that having the Italian dictator in their midst would only complicate their military operations. Hitler would eventually relent, though, and agreed to take Mussolini off the Germans' hands if they could get him to Lake Garda in northern Italy. From there, he could either escape into Switzerland or maybe even make it over the border into Austria, where Hitler promised he'd be safe. This daring rescue operation was carried out by German paratroopers under the Operation Eagle. Cody name Eagle. Don't look at me like that. That is literally what it was called. Anyway, by May 8th, Mussolini was safely ensconced in a lakeside villa near Milan. But how long would his sanctuary last? Not long, as it happens. As part of the deal with the Italians, the Germans were obliged to treat Mussolini as an honored guest and not harm him in any way. But this proved difficult because the longer Mussolini lived, the greater the risk that he might blab something about his time working with the Nazis, which was something the Germans desperately wanted to avoid. In the end, the Germans simply couldn't risk it. And so on April, Mussolini and his wife were executed by a firing squad. His remains were then cremated and thrown into a nearby lake. Just like that, one of the most infamous dictators in history was no more. But as far as victories go, this was a pretty unsatisfying affair. No great speeches, no parades. Just a dictator executed in secret by the enemy he'd foolishly allied himself with. But that was Italy for you. In contrast, the news that really sent the crowds into the streets of London and New York was that on May 7th, the Germans had surrendered to the Allies. It was the news everyone had been waiting for, and the celebrations that followed were some of the greatest in living memory. After 6 years of hardship and struggle, it really felt like the world could finally breathe again. For the Brits, it was especially sweet, because they knew just how close they'd come to defeat. When Britain stood alone in the face of the Nazi war machine, it seemed almost unthinkable that they could win. And yet here they were, preparing to celebrate victory over Germany. There was just one small problem though, because back at the negotiating table, things weren't going quite as smoothly. Churchill was furious. He wanted unconditional surrender. He wanted to cripple Germany and ensure that she never raised her head again. He also wanted to take Berlin and parade the entire Nazi leadership through the streets. As punishment, naturally, the Americans weren't keen on this idea. For them, the war with Germany wasn't personal. They hadn't been fighting Hitler for 6 years, and they didn't have much of a dog in that fight. They had joined the conflict late, sure, but they had bigger fish to fry in the Pacific, and they didn't want to get bogged down in a bitter post-war occupation of Germany. Besides, they were eager to get the country up and running again as soon as possible, so that they could get the raw materials and manufactured goods that flowed so easily from such a well-developed industrial base. And so, despite Churchill's best efforts, unconditional surrender became a condition of surrender, which meant that the Germans could keep their factories, farms, and fields. All the Allies really wanted was territory that they could use as a buffer zone between them and a defeated Germany. But it wasn't just about money and resources, it was also about winning the peace. You see, the Americans thought that they could turn the German people into enthusiastic supporters of the new international order. By guaranteeing basic freedoms and democratic rights, they could make Germany a shining example of liberal democracy and use her as an inspiration to the rest of the world. Of course, this was easier said than done. Millions of Germans had died during the war, and many more had lost everything. But it was still better than turning the nation into a radioactive wasteland, which is what would have happened if the Allies had pushed all the way into Berlin and engaged in a bloody street-to-street battle with Hitler's fanatical followers. So while the celebrations were in full swing, Churchill was hopping mad, and the Germans weren't exactly thrilled either. After all, this whole sorry mess had been started by a bunch of idiots who refused to accept the results of the previous election. Now, thanks to those meddling democracies, they were about to lose their jobs, but there was nothing to be done about it. The German people had voted overwhelmingly in favor of democracy back in 1919, and that was the system they were going to stick with, whether they liked it or not. So on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, bringing an end to hostilities in Europe. It was a huge relief for everyone involved, except, of course, for the Germans. But as far as victories go, it wasn't much of a victory for them. After all, their great leader had taken his own life, and the nation was about to be occupied by its enemies. Still, there was work to be done. A peace treaty had to be drawn up, borders redrawn, and the future of Europe itself was hanging in the balance. But none of that mattered right now. Today was a day for celebration, a day to rejoice that it was finally over. Germany's defeat was the culmination of the Allied victory narrative that had emerged in the early days of the conflict. From the very beginning, the Allies understood that the war wouldn't be won on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people. They needed to show the world that they were fighting for something, that they believed in something worth fighting for, namely freedom, democracy, human rights, and self-determination, and they did that through propaganda. Posters, films, pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and newspapers hammered home the message that the Allies were fighting for something worth fighting for. Theirs was a global crusade against tyranny and oppression, and it was succeeding. Millions of people across the world tuned into the BBC World Service every day to hear the latest news of the conflict, not just because they wanted to know what was happening, but because they wanted to hear the voice of freedom. Listeners in occupied countries risked their lives to tune in to the BBC, and thousands of airmen died broadcasting the signal around the clock. The Allies were fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and above all, freedom from fear. and they won that battle decisively. In the end, the German people had been won over to the democratic cause in such numbers that after the surrender, there were far more communists in Western Germany than fascists. It is a testament to the power of ideas that the Allies were able to win the peace as well as the war. But now they had to win the peace. With their victory over fascism secured, the Allies set about securing their victory over communism, a task that would prove to be far more challenging. If you want to know how the Allies tried to win the Cold War, then why not check out the series on the Cold War on another platform? Victory in the Second World War had been achieved through the combined efforts of all these fine people, and you can learn more about them through additional resources.